Catholic Church. This is CNN.
Fears of a possible trade war between the world's two biggest economies are sending shockwaves through the markets right now. The Dow, take a look at this, it's down about 150 points as investors react to news that China is threatening to retaliate against planned U.S. tariffs with a threat of new tariffs of its own. China says they will target $50 billion worth of U.S. exports to China, slapping a 25% tariff on 106 products in all, including soybeans, cars, and aircraft. The news comes just hours after the U.S. published a list of proposed tariffs affecting more than 1,000 Chinese exports, including aerospace, tech, manufacturing, and medical industries. CNN Money's editor-at-large, Richard Quest, is over at the New York Stock Exchange. Our White House reporter, Caitlin Collins, is on the North Lawn of the White House. Caitlin, how is the president responding to all of this?
Well, unsurprisingly, Wolf, he's tweeting about it, essentially saying there's no point in backing down because he believes the United States is already on the losing end of this trade partnership with China. He wrote a little earlier today on Twitter saying we are not in a trade war with China because that war was lost many years ago by the foolish or incompetent people who have represented the United States. Now we have a trade deficit of $500 billion a year with intellectual property theft of another $300 billion. We cannot let this continue. And then he added a little later on, when you're already $500 billion down, you can't lose. Of course, Wolf, this markets seem a little unconvinced that we're not on the brink of a trade war, but it does seem that the White House is a little concerned about this because they trotted out the new director of the National Economic Council, Larry Kudlow, who I should note has only been on the job for 3 days, to do some interviews earlier this morning, and he spoke with reporters on the North Lawn of the White House, essentially saying that he believes this is more of a negotiating tool. He noted that these tariffs have not gone into effect yet. He said that the chance that these tariffs against China never materialize isn't zero. So certainly he sought to tamp down some fears of a potential trade war there, but right now, Wolf, many people are left wondering what exactly is going to happen here and if there is going to be this tit-for-tat trade war between two of the world's largest economies.
Yeah, Larry Kudlow, formerly of CNBC. Richard, the tariffs have not gone into effect. Kudlow says it'll take a while, that they're both posturing, China and the U.S., so there's some uncertainty about what will happen in the long term. That's clearly having an impact, fueling the market volatility right now. What do you think we can expect, at least in the short term?
More of the same and similar, Wolf. Just look at the way today has gone. We started off with the market down 500 points or so. And then, as you know, obviously many stocks are looking cheap, so the market has pulled back quite a lot. The S&P's even gone positive once or twice. The Dow, nearly the larger market, the broader market, the Russell 2000 has. But Wolf, this is a very risky strategy. If this is a negotiating ploy, as Caitlin was discussing, by the White House, then unfortunately somebody has forgotten to tell the market, because Boeing is down, Caterpillar is down, 3M is down, McDonald's was lower, Microsoft was lower. Every company that has pinned its future growth strategy in some shape or form on China is down. And just for good measure, General Motors today, GM, puts out a statement reminding the administration the significance of coming to a deal and the importance of China to the company.
In terms of the big picture, Richard, how bad is this potentially?
That's a really tricky question, Wolf, because if it's a negotiating strategy, then one assumes cooler heads will prevail and there'll be no tariffs. But if this is mine is bigger than yours, and I'm going to push this as far as I can, then you're looking at a really serious situation here. And we don't know. We don't know because there's no policy statements. We don't know because it's all done by tweet at the moment. Yes, the president tweets, and then Larry Kudlow has to come out and repair the damage. You know, as my grandfather used to say, this is no way to run a railroad.
Richard Quest at the New York Stock Exchange, thanks very much. Caitlin Collins at the White House, thanks to you as well. Meanwhile, President Trump is vowing strong action on the border with Mexico as he calls on U.S. military troops to stand guard until his long-proposed and promised border wall with Mexico is complete.
What defines cutting-edge investments in today's global real estate market. Host John Defterios in 1 square meter gives you a rare peek behind the trendiest places, the best developments, and unique projects around the world. From San Francisco to Shanghai, 1 square meter seeks out the most interesting places and takes an inside look at international properties. 1 square meter, Tuesday in Connect the World with Becky Anderson, in association with MR.
I grew up in a fairly conventional beige household, so I was so proud of what I did in my first apartment. I invited my mother to have lunch. She looked around at all the color, and she said, "You'll outgrow it." Hey, Mom. Here I am, 60-odd years later. When I leave my house, which is full of art, I cannot bear to go out in the street without bringing some of it with me. I can't carry a painting, but I can wrap myself in it. There's a fear of being different, but we're all different inside in one way or the other, so what's wrong with expressing that difference in the way you present yourself to the world?
Given 10 minutes on the ground in the village.
Many of the statues ISIS toppled were fakes.
$500 for 2 children. Just sold us like that.
It's got to really be coming.
Who needs these talks more? We had any government reaction?
What is the mood on the street? Robert? Absolutely, Rob. Robin, it was a surreal period.
On the next Living Golf, we preview the Masters by celebrating the players from Spain who've left a mark on Augusta National. We reflect on Sergio Garcia's incredible win in 2017.
I was like, I'm in a good shot here, and he's in another good shot, and he's making birdie, and I'm making birdie, and I'm making eagle, and he's making birdie. It was great fun to be a part of.
And we remember two-time Masters champion, the late, great Seve Ballesteros, with his son, Javier. Living Golf, Thursday on CNN, in partnership with Rolex.
It all begins with the humble penny. Whether writing your first check or cashing big checks, it's what you do with them that counts. This means business. What a profitable hour!
Welcome back. The president is promising what he calls strong action today. His words, strong action today on securing the U.S. border with Mexico, although it's still not clear what he means by that. His announcement came at the very end of a tweet that also railed against what he blamed weak Obama-era, he called it Obama-era border laws, and accused Democrats of wanting people to, quote, pour into the country unchecked. we do know the president surprised the Pentagon by saying he wanted to send National Guard U.S. military personnel to secure the border with Mexico until his long-promised wall is complete. Joining us now, Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego of Arizona. He sits on the Armed Services Committee. He also served with the United States Marine Corps in Iraq. Congressman, as you know, President Obama sent about 1,200 National Guard troops to the border back in 2010. Is there any difference from your perspective of what former President Obama did and what the current president, President Trump, is now talking about?
Well, we really have to wait for the details, but clearly, the problems you have with Donald Trump, or President Trump, is that he doesn't really have any plans. He kind of just rules by emotion, doesn't actually govern with logic, and is just doing this, to find a political solution, not an actual national security solution, versus what I think President Obama and President Bush did, which is they decided that they need to send military to the border to assist the Border Patrol. And that's what's going to end up happening here. If anything happens, it's not as big as President Trump is going to say, because there's no way that we could secure the border and not break the defense budget. He's basically just going to use this as a show of force, so that way he could appease his base and really not be part of an actual solution, which is comprehensive immigration reform.
We don't know how many U.S. Troops the president is proposing sending to the border with Mexico, but as someone who represents a border state with Mexico, you represent Arizona, is there any number you would support given your military experience and your experience with the border?
Well, the reason I wouldn't actually support it is for two reasons. The reason we don't need to be sending the military border is because you have the Customs and Border Patrol is the largest law enforcement agency in this country, and it's actually bigger than most standing armies in the world. We have enough Border Patrol. We actually have enough Border Patrol that are even the pipeline to get hired. The reason you had Bush and Obama do in the past is because there was not enough Border Patrol. So we've had continuously put money, billions and billions of dollars of money into the border. So let's actually use the money appropriated for that. Again, the reason I'm not going to support this is because this is just a political fix for the president, because he made a stupid campaign promise over a stupid border wall that Mexico is not going to pay for and Congress doesn't want to fund. So he's just trying to appease his base by, quote unquote, putting troops on the border, when in reality, in the past, troops are not allowed to arrest anybody. They're not even allowed to have loaded weapons. So what are they going to be doing on the border? All they're going to be doing is draining our resources and our time from our military.
Well, as you point out, the president was at least in part elected on the promise that he would build a wall along the border with Mexico, secure the border with Mexico, have Mexico pay for that wall. Here's a little reminder. Listen to this.
We are going to build a great border wall. We will build a great, great wall. We're going to build the wall. Don't worry about it. We'll build the wall. I promise we will build the wall. It's not going to be a little wall. It's going to be a big, beautiful wall. It's going to be a very tall wall, very strong wall, very powerful wall. It's going to be such a beautiful wall. It's going to be so big. It's going to be so powerful. It's going to be as beautiful as a wall can be.
That's what he promised the American people during the campaign. Many people voted for him in part because of that promise. He argues that Democrats are now standing in the way of that. You saw his tweet earlier in the day. Congress must change these Obama era and other laws now.
Well, look, if the president was actually, the master of the art of the deal he likes to call himself, he would have actually had most of these initiatives done. He would have had a big portion of his wall funded, and he actually would have had some of these immigration laws changed. There's a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans that went to the president just a couple months ago and said, here's the deal. In exchange for DACA, we will change our immigration laws, and we will actually put a big down payment and start building a border wall. He didn't take the deal. So the reason why this is not happening is not because of the Democrats in the House or in the Senate, or even the Republicans in the House and Senate. It's because the president is a bad president. He does not know how to deal. He doesn't have the administration around him, the administrators around him, to actually know how to accept a good compromise. And now he realizes that he's not going to be able to fulfill his campaign promises before the election, so he's going to do all these theatrics. And part of those theatrics is using our troops, our manpower, and sending them to the border when in reality it's not needed.
Let's talk about Syria for a moment, Congressman. While I have you, as I pointed out, you served with the U.S. Marines in Iraq. The president told his national security team he's now willing to allow U.S. troops, about 2,000 U.S. troops, to stay in Syria short term, but he's publicly made it known that he wants them out very soon. Listen to this.
I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. I want to start rebuilding our nation. We will have, as of 3 months ago, $7 trillion in the Middle East over the last 17 years. We get nothing out of it. Nothing.
And clearly suggesting that the U.S. military involvement over these 17 years in Afghanistan, Iraq, now in Syria, has been a total waste. Does he have a point?
Well, in some degrees he does have a point, but, I also want to point out this is the same president that chastised President Obama for telegraphing that we're going to leave Iraq. And now he's essentially doing the same thing. So, again, President Trump really has a black belt when it comes to hypocrisy. Look, the Middle East is a very difficult place. I fought all the way up to the Syrian border, actually, and I know exactly what many of our men and women are dealing with over there. But the best way to deal with this is to have steady leadership with steady alliances all around the world and in the Middle East, instead of this, bouncing off the wall and just kind of going by your gut kind of reaction the president's having right now. That causes a lot of instability. That causes our allies in the region to overreact or underreact. And more importantly, it empowers Russia to be the big mover in that region, and Iran, because they're at least having some level of stable leadership versus President Trump, who is basically just all over the place. So what he needs to do is actually act more presidential, talk to his national security advisors, come up with a plan for the region, and not just basically see what sticks on the wall.
Congressman Gallego, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wolf.
Today, 50 years after his assassination, thousands of people are marching here in Washington in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Up next, I'll speak with the civil rights icon's daughter on his legacy.
World trade can start just about anywhere. The exchange of goods and services can make traders of us all. Meet the entrepreneurs working to make it in a foreign market, and see the challenges businesses face along the way. Traders, Inquest Means Business. Tonight on CNN, in association with DHL.
You are watching an auction of human beings. There are 12 Nigerians that were sold in front of us. They come in their thousands.
We're now in Tripoli. There are 1 to 2 of these auctions every month.
CNN, the world's news leader. But not only news. Introducing CNN Vision. See more of the world. See the people. The places. See award-winning programs. From around the globe. Breathtaking images. Inspiring stories. Global diversity. Look beyond the news. Be a part of it. See more. CNN Vision.
Starting Sunday on CNN, get a jump on the U.S. political scene with Inside Politics.
The Republican president threatened to oppose members of his own party.
Then, State of the Union with Jake Tapper.
Should President Trump apologize to President Obama and to the American people?
Fareed Zakaria at GPS.
We are living through a sea change in politics.
And Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
With respect, sir, just stop you there for one moment. That is not the government.
It all starts Sunday on CNN. No holds barred.
Out front tonight, hypocrite in chief. So let me just put it
to you straight, Senator. Senate Democrats, they're getting their butts kicked.
No nonsense.
Are you simply shooting the messenger because you don't like the message?
Facts first.
How stupid do you think we are? Allies in Washington are covering for him, and they shouldn't get away with it.
Because getting to the truth matters.
The Washington Post went and confirmed the date of that hearing. So you're telling me unless I go back in the time capsule, you're not going to believe it.
Aaron Burnett out front. Saturday on CNN.
Career in the field, and I think that informs who I want to talk to, but more importantly, who wants to and who accepts to talk to me. Mr. President, hi, Prime Minister, and I hope that what I bring to the table is a rigorous search for the truth and a rigorous determination and an effort to hold power accountable. What may they not want to hear? Will you back off if the protests get too strong? No, I will deliver. What do you make of President Trump saying that he'd be honored to meet Kim Jong-un? I want to ask you to respond to their response. It is not easy to keep pushing and keep digging and keep trying to make a world leader answer a question and not let them off the hook. So I know that I have sort of one chance, and I'm going to make the best of it.
Aman Paul, tonight on CNN.
I'm Paula Newton in Caracas, and this is CNN.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over that. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest our rights.
Powerful words from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivering his final, very famous speech back in 1968 in Memphis before his life was so tragically cut short by an assassin. Today, 50 years later, commemorations are being held nationwide to honor his life and his legacy. Joining us now, Dr. King's youngest child, Bernice King, also with us, CNN contributor, former president of the NAACP, Cornell William Brooks. Bernice, you were just 5 years old when your father was killed. What does it mean to you to see these major tributes to your dad, people marching, listening to his speeches, remembering his legacy all these years later?
First of all, Boots, thank you for having me on today. I'm always honored and humbled whenever I hear people referring to my father and whenever we have these moments because, you know, I was raised in a household where my mother taught us about my father, always invoking his words. And so I developed a deep appreciation through the years of his teachings. And I think in the way that our world is today, that now, perhaps more than ever before, we need the teachings of Dr. King. His words were so poignant at the time, and they're still very relevant now. And the legacy that he's left for us of nonviolent social change and peace with justice is something that, you know, resonates. And you know, I hope that people will use this day to not only just commemorate and remember, but really act in his spirit to bring about the changes that are needed to create a more just, humane, and peaceful world.
If your dad were with us today, Bernice, what do you think he would say about some of the recent movements we've seen unfold, like the Me Too movement or the rallies against gun violence? What do you think he would say about all of what's happening in our country today?
You know, I think he would, first of all, I think he would be excited. My father never lost hope. Even when it became dark and dismal and looked like his dream became a nightmare, he said he still maintained hope. And so that hope is because he knew that there would always be what he called a dedicated minority who would be committed to justice and peace and equity, and to see young people rising up the way that they've been rising up, starting with the Black Lives Matter and coming forward to Me Too, the women's movement, and the children, the young people that have been raising their voices recently with March for Our Lives. He would say that there's a resurgence. There's, that what he said back then, these are revolutionary times. Revolution for Dr. King was when you saw changes in systems and people, and these movements now are beginning to cause conversations and dialogue that have been needed through the years as it relates to some of the issues we've kind of brushed under the rug in terms of gender equity, in terms of violence in our culture, in terms of white privilege and systemic and racial injustice. And so he would be extremely excited, and I'm sure that he would be making connections with these movements to make sure that they had what they needed in terms of understanding organizational strategy and planning so that they could bring about effective change.
Speaking of young people, your niece is only in the 4th grade, but she had a very, very public role at that March for Our Lives event here in Washington. Listen to this.
My grandfather had a dream that his 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that enough is enough.
She grows up and she is amazing. What is the #1 lesson you think you'd like her to hold on to when it comes to her grandfather?
Well, I think just as the rest of us, that nonviolence is the most potent weapon we have to bring about social change. It is something that all of us must embrace as a lifestyle. And so, we're teaching her that. And obviously, I think she's learning some things. A lot of this stuff that comes out of her, it comes from her. It's not being prompted. People should know that. And we thank God that there will be a generation behind us that will continue in the tradition of our parents and us. And Yolanda Renee is going to be something to watch.
Yeah, she's an amazing little young girl, and all of us watched and admired her appearance there. Bernice, thanks so much for joining us on this important day.
Thank you, Wolf. I appreciate it.
Let's go to Cornell right now. So, Cornell, what is it about Dr. King that continues to influence younger generations that weren't even born 50 years ago, weren't even around during his lifetime?
Wow. So, one of the things I'm just morally mindful of is the fact that we have this generation of young people who understand that America's most morally prominent apostle of nonviolence was himself a victim of gun violence. And so we are commemorating the anniversary of his death as his legacy lives on in literally not just his granddaughter, but the grandchildren of Dr. King, of every hue and heritage, who are standing against gun violence all across the country, whether perpetuated by police officers or mass shooters in schools. And so these young people literally understand that Dr. King's legacy is not about inheritance, but rather instruction. We have to share it with them. We have to teach it. We have to understand and appreciate the fact that today is not merely about nostalgic commemoration, but rather about moral emulation. And we see it. They are, in fact, emulating Dr. King through protest, through demonstration, through registering people to vote. So his legacy lives on, and that is something that we should all celebrate.
I know we've made tremendous progress, but there's still a long way to go. If he were with us today, what do you think he would say?
I think Dr. King would be tremendously concerned about the amount of violence that we have in our culture. The fact that we have literally thousands and thousands of Americans who lose their lives at the hands of guns, carried by civilians. And we also have 950 to 1,000 people lose their lives at the hands of guns carried by police officers. He'd be concerned about a culture of gun violence. He'd be concerned about the sophisticated voter suppression 50 years later as opposed to the crude voter denial 50 years ago. But more than anything, Dr. King would preach to us about the necessity of having hope. You can't make the empirical case for hope, because hope is not a matter of an empirical proof, but a moral choice. And so Dr. King would call on us to persist and prevail in terms of nonviolence and to perpetuate and move his legacy forward. That, I believe, we're doing in spite of all the challenges. And I would also note this, Wolf. He would call us to love, because when we are in the era of rising hate crime against Muslims, against Jews, against Latinos, African Americans, trans folk, Dr. King would call us to love, practicing agape love, unconditional love. Because at the end of the day, love is not some kind of secular nicety or civic platitude. It is the substance of this democracy. We need it literally to survive as a country, as a society, as a community, as humanity. I believe he would say that to us.
Yeah, good point. Cornell William Brooks, thanks for joining us on this very important day. That does it for me. To all of our viewers, thanks very much for watching. The news continues right after a quick break.
I'm Shimana Karachi Naman, and this is CNN.
With information moving at lightning speed, you need a news program to help put it all into perspective. We move fast to deliver in-depth world news and emerging tech trends, bring what's next into focus for you. And that is Newsstream, the only international news program anchored from right here in Hong Kong, and we're happy to have you along for the ride.
Newsstream with Christy Lou Stout, weekdays only on CNN.
We live in such a fast-paced world where the news has been so relentless. Historic events have happened one after the other. I think that you need that daily appointment with viewers around the world to try and sort through the news of the day. What's important? Why does it matter to me? How do I put it all in context? We follow the news as it happens and where it happens. And then we also take a step to walk the viewer through the day's news. That is the mission of Hala Garani tonight.
I'm Jim Bitterman in Paris, and this is CNN.
Tonight, 50 years
after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, what will it take to rekindle the dream? I asked William Jawando, a former Obama official who helped launch a mentoring initiative for young black men, and civil rights activist Bree Newsom, who's joining us from Memphis, where she's joining the 50th anniversary commemorations for Dr. King. Plus, we talk with the publisher of Dr. King's papers, Professor Claiborne Carson, who's with us from Stanford University. And welcome to the program. I'm Christiana Manpour in London. 50 years ago, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, a man who dedicated his entire life to non-violent protest was brutally assassinated. America's most famous, most revered civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., cut down at the age of just 39, and eerily, just a day after he delivered his final and prophetic speech, in which he worried about his own survival and that of his movement.
And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
And indeed, in the 50 years since his death, there has undoubtedly been progress in black America. There is a black middle class, and the country has elected its first black president. And then came this anguished reaction on the night of Donald Trump's election by the renowned political commentator Van Jones.
This was a white lash. This was a white lash against a changing country. It was a white lash against a black president in part. And that's the part where the pain comes.
Dramatic words indeed. A year before he was killed, Martin Luther King Jr. worried that, quote, the vast majority of white Americans are racist, either consciously or unconsciously. And my two guests tonight are well placed to discuss all of this. William Jawando is an attorney who worked in the Obama White House on the initiative called My Brother's Keeper, designed to help young black men climb up the ladder of life. And he is now running for local office in his home state, Maryland. And also Bree Newsom. She came to national attention when she removed the Confederate flag from the grounds of the South Carolina State House. She's a civil rights activist, and she's with us from Memphis, where she's been attending the commemorations for Dr. King. Welcome, both of you, to the program on this 50th anniversary, which is actually a sad day. Can I ask you, Bree, what it means to you to be a black American today? You heard us quote what Dr. King said a year before he died.
I would say there are some things that are new, and then there's some things that are very familiar in the history of America. We have a long history in this country of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We've seen progress with the election of the nation's first black president, but we've also seen steps taken backwards. Mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, incident after incident of police brutality. And so these are the same conditions that are contributing to what we see now. And so in some ways, there are things that are new, but in a lot of ways, what's old is new again.
All right, we're going to dive into some of those specifics you've talked about in a moment. But first to you, William Jawando. You worked in the Obama White House, the first black president. It stunned everybody, but it was a moment of great hope. You heard what Van Jones said on the night that President Trump probably even surprised himself by winning, that this was a white lash, he thought. So given your experience in the White House and now, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to be black in America today?
Well, to be black in America is to know that you're in a precarious situation, in that freedoms that have recently been won or acquired, or progress that has been made, can be taken away in an instant. Think of the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, where you had state senators and congressmen who were African-American, and how that was snatched away, violently so, through lynchings and through Jim Crow laws and segregation. And so the step backwards that Bree was talking about is really the story of being black in America. So you have to remain vigilant. You have to remain aware. And I remember I was working in Ohio when President Obama was elected on the campaign, and I was so elated. We won Ohio. We knew we had won the presidency. And I walked outside, and a middle-aged white person was taking his trash down the driveway and said to me, well, I guess racism's over now, kind of very, disgruntled. And so I knew even then that we were going to have, a tough time ahead, and that's really what it is to be black in America, to be sober, understand history, and to keep pushing forward even when you have some success.
All right, so let's take this excerpt of a speech that Dr. King made about a year before he was assassinated. These are some very pointed comments he made about the state of society for blacks in America.
Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the battering rams of the forces of justice. Let us be dissatisfied until the dark yesterdays of segregated schools will be transformed into bright tomorrows of quality integrated education. Let us be dissatisfied until men and women, however black they may be, will be judged on the basis of the content of their character, not on the basis of the color of their skin. Let us be dissatisfied.
It's really an amazing rallying cry. So, Bree, you mentioned the issue of segregation, and new reports today show that the promise of Brown versus Board of Education, and Linda Brown, who was the center of this, the little black girl who was the center, just died last month, and yet we hear reports that schools are going back to segregation in parts of the South.
Yes, absolutely. So in my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, which at one point was really heralded for its efforts to bus students and to integrate the schools, what we now see is that our school system is as segregated as it was in the 1960s. And I think it's important to recognize that as soon as legal segregation ended, it wasn't as though everyone embraced this idea of integration. There were people who moved forward with that effort, but there's always been a consistent effort to resegregate. And so what we have in many ways is a de facto segregation. I think sometimes it's a kind of false understanding of what happened in the 60s if we think that it ended in victory and that everything that we are dealing with now is simply reaping the benefits of the 60s civil rights movement.
William, I just want to pick up with you on the issue of economic justice. I mean, the I Have a Dream speech in Washington was as much about economic dreams that Martin Luther King had as about integration. So I was stunned. I was stunned by the contents of a recent report that suggests that even a young black man, a boy who grows up in a well-to-do black family, living next door to a well-to-do white family, despite the father or the parents' wealth, that boy, and particularly boy, is likely to end up poorer than his white neighbor.
If you're in 99% of American communities, if you're a black boy, you're going to have a consistent and persistent income gap from your white male peer, even if you were born with the same economic circumstances. So if you were born in the top 1% of families as an African-American boy, you have just as much likelihood of being incarcerated as a white boy born in a household making $36,000. So if you're a millionaire black boy, your chances of being incarcerated are the same as a white boy from a household that has $36,000. You're just as likely to fall out of the top income brackets as you are to stay if you're an African-American boy. So just stunning data. And it's also, once you control for every other circumstance that the excuses that have been used, family structure, household income, level of education, when you control for all those things, that gap is still there. And it shows us in really stark terms the legacy of institutional racism and discrimination.
Just to not to put too fine a point on it, but basically, Paul Ryan, the House Speaker, maintains that anyone could work their way up out of their situation. This is not a race thing, it's a poor thing. Poverty knows no racial boundaries. But this study, in fact, does debunk that theory.
Oh, it does. And it's something that we as African Americans knew for a long time because we experienced it. but this puts hard data in that if you take a white boy and a black boy from the same income bracket, same level of education, same circumstances, there's going to be a consistent income gap of 10 points or more all the way up the economic ladder. So I was fortunate. I'm one of the rare. I'm in the 1% of African American boys that made it from the bottom to the top, but I'm a rare story, and we need to make sure that we're changing policies so that I'm not such a rare story.
So, Bree, you really came to prominence when you decided to remove the Confederate flag from the state capitol in South Carolina. This was after Dylann Roof shot up a church full of black worshippers. What gave you the courage to do that? And you even recited the Lord's Prayer as you were being arrested. Was there anything of Dr. King going through your mind at that point?
Yes, absolutely. In the lead up to the time that I scaled the pole, of course, I was aware of the dangers that I faced, really even more so than being arrested. My primary concern was a vigilante coming by with a gun, so that was my greatest concern, and I reflected very much so on King, on nonviolent civil disobedience, on the kind of courage that it took for everyone who participated in that movement to do what they did. And I also recognized that the rights that I have today, I wouldn't enjoy were it not for people who exercised the courage that they exercised in the times in which they lived. For me, it was very important to make that statement at that time. There was South Carolina processing the casket of Clementa Pinckney through the streets of Columbia, South Carolina. The United States flag was at half-staff. The state flag of South Carolina was at half-staff, but the Confederate flag was at the top of the pole. And symbolically, that moment just encapsulated everything that we had been saying when we said Black Lives Matter. To your earlier point that you were making about economics and racism, part of why I became involved in the modern movement, I grew up in a very solidly middle-class family household. I'm the third generation in my family to graduate from college. What I recognized, however, when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down voting rights in 2013, when I saw the Trayvon Martin case unfold, was that there was no level of education, there was no level of income that could shield me from racism, that could protect me from being the next Trayvon Martin or protect my child from being the next Trayvon Martin.
And the violence that you mentioned, obviously the latest tragic headline is Stephen Clark in California. You heard from the White House, I believe they called it a local matter, the press spokeswoman at the White House. But I guess, William Jawando, I want to ask you, because again, it really matters to boys. You know, I hear and I read these chilling reports that fathers have to have the conversation with their kids as young as 11 years old, how to behave in white neighborhoods, or if you're going to pass white law enforcement, or whatever it might be. You're obviously the father of girls, but was that conversation ever had to you? And the fact that it's still necessary is terrifying.
Well, that's a conversation that every black parent has with their child, or parent of black children and has with their child, boy or girl, and it's something that's going to need to be continued, unfortunately, for a long time. You know, Dr. King said that the soul of the nation cannot be redeemed until we eradicate racism in all of its forms. And when Bree climbed the pole and pulled the flag down, that was a sample of racism in all of its forms. And when we are dealing with these police-involved shootings, when we're dealing with economic justice issues and wide disparities between black boys and their white male counterparts, these are all vestiges and legacies of slavery. And so these conversations are going to need to happen continually in black households, and they will. But we're also going to need to make sure that we're continuing Dr. King's mission, continuing to put policies in place that get at the heart of these types of things. We're not helpless to this. Implicit bias training is required and necessary for law enforcement officers who, when they see a black boy, are much quicker to pull their guns from data and research than they are to seeing a white boy. And so there are things we can do. We're not helpless to this data. One of the things that was in the report that we talked about earlier is that one of the bright spots, even though that in 99% of America, black boys do far worse economically than white boys, out of those 1% communities, we learned that even if you don't have a father at the home, for example, which was my case for much of my early life, if you have fathers and mentor-like figures in your community, you benefit and have a better chance of moving up the economic ladder. That's why programs like My Brother's Keeper, which I was proud to kick off at the White House and be a part of, are so important.
What do you make of the anger amongst the black community, the Black Lives Matter community, after the shootings at Parkland, when a white school was or a mostly white school was targeted in a mostly white neighborhood, and there was a mass mobilization, huge amounts of celebrity money pledged, marches, and all the rest of it. Now, Emma Gonzalez, one of the faces of that movement, has reached out and spoken about, yes, how we need to both be in this together, both communities. How does that sit with you, Bree?
I think it's important to recognize anger is often a secondary emotion to hurt. I think that what many of the Black Lives Matter protesters have been expressing is a deep sense of hurt. What has been expressed by young people, not only Black Lives Matter protests, but even black youth have been protesting over the issue of gun violence in their communities, have been protesting over this issue for years, has nothing to do with the students in Parkland. They completely empathize with the students in Parkland. What they are speaking to, again, is how pervasive racism is, that racism is so pervasive that it manifests even in how people show empathy for people. Another example recently is the bombings in Austin. We had a white terrorist sending bombs through packages in the mail, and there seemed to be as much or maybe even more empathy for the terrorists than for the black victims. And so again, it's really just highlighting the pervasive, really insidious nature of racism in America.
And Christiane, if I could chime in on that, just because Bree is hitting such an important point. The racism is so embedded into every institution in this country. Just give you two examples. When Tamir Rice was shot, within 10 seconds of a police officer pulling up to him in Ohio Park, the officer called in, we just shot 18-year-old with a gun. And Tamir was 14 years old. There's data from the American Psychological Association that shows that when people see young black boys, they think they're 4 to 5 years older than what they are. They think they're a threat. They think they're dangerous. I'll give you another example. The opioid crisis that's going on in this country right now, African Americans have not been as effective. It's actually, because of racism, we're not doing as bad in this indicator. Partly because it's shown that doctors, because of this lack of empathy that we're talking about, prescribe painkillers to African Americans at a much lower rate. So they have not gotten hooked to some of these opioids because they think that we have a higher tolerance for pain. There's less empathy. So the racism, the stereotypes that have been pervasive and are part of a legacy of transatlantic slave trade to today are so embedded into our system that we have much more work to do to break those things down and make sure that we're moving forward and understanding our biases.
Much work to do, and thank you so much to both of you on this anniversary. William Jawando, Bree Newsome, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And Martin Luther King's famous dream for America resonated all over the world. Indeed, many said the dream died with him that awful night, April 4th, 1968. When news of the assassination in Memphis reached Robert F. Kennedy, who was campaigning for the presidency over in Indianapolis, he knew that he would have to try to keep the peace. So he went to a black neighborhood there to share their grief and tried to inspire hope that the dream was still possible. Here's some of what he said that night.
It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land.
Do they, though, all these years later? We turn now to the historian and professor of American history, Claiborne Carson. He was at the famous speech on the Mall in Washington when he was just 19, and later, King's widow asked him to publish his papers. Professor Carson joins us now from Stanford University. Welcome to the program, Professor.
Good to be with you.
I just wonder what goes through your mind all these years later as you heard those words of Robert F. Kennedy, 50 years later.
I think that for me, it was
hearing the same news, there was a deep sense of loss. I had actually left the country in 1967 for a variety of reasons, but partially because I refused to be inducted into the military. And so when I came back in 1968, it was a shock because just within days of getting back in the States, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then back in Los Angeles, a couple of months later, Robert Kennedy himself was assassinated. So it seemed that I was returning to a country that was coming apart, and it was a shock. And the years that followed were an indication of how much hadn't changed because of civil rights reforms. In the areas I was in, these reforms had very little impact.
So tell me,
there was still segregation, lack of jobs, poverty. So I think that in some respects, the passage of civil rights legislation made us complacent about the parts of Martin Luther King's dream that hadn't been achieved.
just walk me through. You were 19, as I said, when that famous speech on the Washington Mall took place. You were there. And then how did Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow, choose you to gather, edit, and publish his papers?
Well, when I entered the historical profession, I wanted to focus on the question of how does change take place, and I wrote a book called In Struggle, which was about the emergence of grassroots activism during the 1950s and 60s in the South. So I think I was a bit surprised when she called and asked me to edit Martin Luther King's papers, because I had always emphasized the bottom-up approach. And he, of course, was the main national leader of the movement. And but after talking with her, she had heard about me from another historian who was her advisor, and she felt that because of my background of being in the movement, studying the movement for civil rights reform in the 1960s, that I would be an appropriate person to look at Martin Luther King. And for me, it was telling the other part of the story.
I wanted to ask about another part of the story, and that is that, you know, we read, of course, that towards the end of his life, there was pressure from the more militant side of the Black rights movement, and that at one point, Dr. King, who was a committed integrationist, had said and espoused the notion of temporary separatism. Tell me about that, and how serious was he about that as a cure for what wasn't happening on the integration front?
Well, the thing I've discovered about Martin Luther King that is most important is how consistent he was throughout his life. I don't think he ever went over to being a separatist. He was simply saying that we have to recognize the reality of that many Black people are segregated. His own organization was an organization primarily of Black Baptist ministers. And the churches that they pastored were pretty much Black churches. They had very few white members. That was a matter of history and choices. And I think that's still the case. He pointed out that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in American society. So we have to look at American society as it really is. And he was trying to make it into something that was his ideal of, you know, the last book he wrote was, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And he wrote that after the passage of civil rights laws, and he said that we have, as a nation, we have to decide whether we're going to be a community and really come together. And that's what he meant by integration. It was not just on the surface, but at a deeper level. Or there's going to be chaos.
Yeah, we're still pondering, obviously, aren't we, the choice, chaos or community?
I don't think we've answered his question.
Well, right, exactly. And just finally, you, along with others like the poet Maya Angelou, chose the words that were going to be on his memorial, the big white statue that's in Washington right now. What were the words that you chose? What was particularly meaningful for you?
Well, the words that were supposed to be on the side of the memorial were the words from the opening of his I Have a Dream speech, where he talks about the promissory note. And what he meant was that promise that the nation had made in its own Declaration of Independence, that there were these inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those were human rights ideals. And I thought of the monument as Martin Luther King looking across the tidal basin at Thomas Jefferson and talking to the architects of the Republic and saying that you have not lived up to this ideal that justified the creation of the United States. And I think that that was his primary message throughout his life, is that we have these ideals as Christians, as religious people, as Americans, and perhaps throughout the world we have these ideals that we profess, but we're not living up to them.
All right.
And I think that's always the job of the minister.
Indeed. And it's good to leave us with that thought, that ideals are there to be realized. Professor Carson, thank you so much. And that is it for our program tonight. Remember, you can always listen to our podcast and see us online at amadpour.com. And of course, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and goodbye from London.
Living up to them.
All right.
And I think that's always the job of the minister.
Indeed. And it's good to leave us with that thought, that ideals are there to be realized. Professor Carson, thank you so much. And that is it for our program tonight. Remember, you can always listen to our podcast and see us online at amadpour.com. And of course, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and goodbye from London.
With innovation and embrace victory. Tango Tar and Real Madrid, together as one. Tango Tar, global partner of Real Madrid.
Thailand has embarked on a progressive plan to transform its Eastern Economic Corridor, or EEC. By 2022, the EEC will be a hub for advanced technology industries, creating enormous business opportunities for the ASEAN region. Strong infrastructure is being built to connect land, sea, and air transport networks. Utapao Airport is reimagined as an aviation logistics hub, while the Lemchabang Seaport is further developed into a sea transportation centre. On land, high-speed rail and highways will connect the sea and airports with major urban and industrial centres. The smart city will feature a robust lifestyle. Along with its innovative plans, the EEC is set to position Thailand as a premier business and lifestyle location in the ASEAN region. Thailand taking off to new heights.
CNN Money, your new destination for business news. On TV, online, on the go.
in Sinjar, Iran, and this is CNN.
China hits back at the U.S. on tariffs and stocks take a nosedive. Plus, Robert Mueller may not see the president as a target in his Russia probe, but sources say he is still more than a witness. And the White House tries to clarify Trump's strategy on Syria. This is the State of America Tonight.
We intend to get along with China, but we have to do something very substantial about the trade deficit.
The White House is showing leadership here. We don't have fair trade with China. China may be targeting the demographic that has voted for the current administration.
This is going to hurt, the country and specifically where the president has done well.
He campaigned on this. All those good farmers in the Midwest who voted for Donald Trump and now are getting hammered. Sorry. Hello, I'm John Avlon, live in New York, and this is the State of America Tonight. Now, for a man who loves to take credit when stocks surge, the past few weeks have been pretty brutal for President Trump. The Dow is battling back from a sharp decline after China retaliated against recent U.S. tariffs, and fears of a trade war intensified, with China slapping a 25% tariff on U.S. goods, including soybeans, planes, cars, and chemicals. But just yesterday, the president said ties between the two countries are strong.
Our relationship is very good with China, and we intend to keep it that way. But we have to do something to seriously relieve that trade deficit. We can't have a $500 billion a year trade deficit.
And just this morning, the president pushed back on any concerns, declaring that the U.S. is not in a trade war with China. But a check of his Twitter feed shows that even if it were, the president wouldn't be too worried. Here's what he wrote in early March, quote, "When a country, USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win." Well, time will tell if the president's business acumen proves right on that one. But there's another critical foreign policy issue that's top of mind for the White House today. I'm talking about Syria. Remember when the president said this last week?
We're knocking the hell out of ISIS. We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now.
Now, that unexpected announcement stunned members of Trump's staff who were left scrambling to figure out his strategy. Well, today we all got a little clarity. A senior administration official says President Trump will keep troops in Syria for the short term, but told his national security team he wants them to leave soon. And that comes after top commanders told Trump that the battle against ISIS has not yet been won. At least one former Army general says the number of troops could actually increase in the short run.
You might see a slight uptick, too, because that's what General Votel has asked for, along with General Thomas. They know that the toughest part of the fight is after the fight's over, when you're trying to stabilize the communities. I think many people have been recommending that to the president.
Now to a subject the president has been surprisingly silent on today, at least on social media, and that's the Russia probe. President Trump's lawyers have been told that he is not a target in Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation. That's according to sources familiar with recent conversations. But those sources also say the president is viewed as more than a witness, meaning that the president could be the subject of an investigation. And that's why CNN's chief legal analyst says that Trump shouldn't be breaking out the champagne just yet.
Trump is a subject, and I don't think that's particularly good news for him. I mean, it's a big deal to be under criminal investigation by the FBI, particularly if you're president of the United States. But being a subject is a very serious thing. That means the prosecutors are determining whether to file charges against you.
Got that? Well, here's how prominent Republican Congressman Trey Gowdy, a former federal prosecutor, summed up the crucial differences.
I don't think those terms, target versus subject, the only word that matters to me in the criminal justice system is defendant. One witness can take you from being a subject to a target. And unless and until you've interviewed everyone and looked at everything, no one has been implicated and no one has been exculpated.
Now, Gowdy went on to say that when it comes to Mueller's desire to speak one-on-one with the president, Mr. Trump should comply.
I would tell you, if you did not rob the bank, there's no reason for you not to sit down and talk to the FBI about the bank robbery. If you have nothing to hide, sit down, assuming a fair prosecutor, and I think Mueller is, sit down and tell him what you know.
Sage advice. Well, now, for more on that roller coaster ride for stocks, I am joined by CNN Money editor-at-large and host of Quest Means Business, Richard Quest. Richard, the markets are clearly rattled, but they are off their lows for the session. Now, is that a sign that investors think cooler heads will prevail and that a potential trade war between China and the U.S. might be avoided?
No, I don't think that's at all the situation. I think the markets are off the lows because they probably just thought it was overdone this morning, and that maybe when you look at the total situation, it might not be as bleak as people had thought. But anybody who, for 1 second, believes that if these tariffs come into effect in 60 days' time, that the market wouldn't fall out of bed is deluding themselves. The reality is that the market is hoping and praying that these tariffs don't come into effect. But Boeing is still being beaten up by 2 to 4%. Caterpillar has been beaten up as well. You've still got the president attacking Amazon. You've got 3M shares that are down. And you have a situation whereby the president tweets that it's not a war because they've already lost. But he has to send his new economic advisor, chairman of the Economic Council, Larry Kudlow, he has to send him out to mollify the markets.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned that because we've got a clip of Mr. Kudlow that I'd like to play for folks and get your reaction. Because he says it's all a big misunderstanding.
I would take the president seriously on this tariff issue. There are carrots and sticks in life. But he is ultimately a free trader. He said that to me. He said it publicly. So he wants to solve this with the least amount of pain.
He is ultimately a free trader. This is just a bit of gamesmanship. Why can't we get that, Richard?
We can't get it because there's always the possibility of it not happening. Look, John, if this is all a massive negotiation strategy that's being done in the full glare of public and that, then so be it. Then we will all find out in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks' time that that's all it was, and the markets will rally back up again. However, if this turns out to be an accident waiting to happen, then you've got to be ready for that. And that's what the markets are telling you. You can't play with dynamite and simply say, well, we didn't really expect it to blow up in our faces. There is always the risk that the other side does something unpredictable, which they haven't, by the way. The other side so far, China, has been absolutely predictable and moderate in its response. The reality is, it's the administration in Washington that now has to say what its policy is and what it will do next. John, finally on this, if they manage to contain it to the sanctions and tariffs announced so far, everything's fair enough. But if we start getting into a mine's bigger than yours, then we're in deep trouble.
Sage advice about not playing for economic dynamite from Richard Quest. Thank you, my friend. We'll see what happens. Now, when the State of America returns, we're going to be talking trade wars and how China's proposed tariffs just might hit President Trump's base the hardest. Stay with us. It's time to shine a new light on home security. Introducing Spotlight Cam by Ring, a motion-activated security camera.
You guys lost?
With powerful lights and an alarm. 180 degrees of advanced motion detection. Smart alerts to your phone.
I have you on camera, you need to leave.
So you always know what's going on. For smart security in every corner of your home. Available at ring.com.
On the next Living Golf, we preview the Masters by celebrating the players from Spain who've left a mark on Augusta National. We reflect on Sergio Garcia's incredible win in 2017.
I was like, I'm hitting a good shot here, and he's in another good shot, and he's making birdie, and I'm making birdie, and I'm making eagle, and he's making birdie. It was great fun to be a part of.
And we remember two-time Masters champion, the late, great Seve Ballesteros, with his son, Javier. Living Golf, Thursday on CNN, in partnership with Rolex.
limitless. Historic events have happened one after the other. I think that you need that daily appointment with viewers around the world to try and sort through the news of the day. What's important? Why does it matter to me? How do I put it all in context? We follow the news as it happens and where it happens. And then we also take a step back to walk the viewer through the day's news. That is the mission of Halagarani tonight.
Now, President Trump campaigned as a businessman who would know how to fire up America's economic engine. But now, with the stock market struggling amid fears of a trade war, there are questions about where he's steering the country. So we're going to chat about it with our panel. We've got CNN political commentator Catherine Rampell, also a columnist for The Washington Post, S.E. Cupp, a CNN political commentator and host of HLN's S.E. Cupp Unfiltered, Joe Borelli, New York City councilman and Trump supporter, and CNN political commentator Joan Walsh is also the national affairs correspondent for The Nation. Are we duly noted? All right, this is a big deal, this escalation, because it seems to have the unintentional consequence, at least on the president's part, of having the impact be felt by his base. So, Catherine, here's the question. When they go day one against pork and soybeans hard, is that really targeting Iowa, Terry Branstad, and the president's base intentionally?
I think so. I think there's no other way to read this. If you look at Iowa's top 20 exports, more than half of them have now been targeted by China. There is no way that is a coincidence. And it's not only Iowa, it's other parts of Trump's base that will be hit by this, not only by the tariffs that China is targeting, of course, but also the fact that when we put tariffs on steel and aluminum, that hurts manufacturers in Iowa who purchase steel and aluminum. So they get hit doubly hard.
So, Joe, I mean, this is something that if you were looking for a tariff war, a trade war that was going to really hurt the president's base, that crucial Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, you'd come up with a package that looks something like this. How is this a good thing for his base? Is there going to be serious buyer's remorse on the part of the president's base pretty soon?
Well, no. So if you look at this big package, right, it's really $50 billion, which in and of itself is only 2 or 3% of total Chinese imports of United States goods. So it's more strategic than overarching. And when you talk about the strategery, as President W. would say, they are looking at places where there's more of a political impact on President Trump than an overall impact. If we're talking about volatility at 24,000, the Dow Jones, though, and saying how this is chaotic and how this is a problem, let's also look at the 30% growth over the past year, and let's say that this is what the Trump base is more excited about, because if, again, you can't complain about volatility at this number without acknowledging that the number's a lot higher than where it was.
We acknowledge that the economy's been going gangbusters on President Trump, particularly Wall Street, which is not Main Street economy. You're saying there's nothing to see here, not a big deal, Joan. But the whole question in American politics is what happens to that working class base in the upper Midwest that had traditionally voted Democrat, defected big time for Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where's Joe wrong?
I think Joe's wrong. I think he knows he's wrong. I mean, we've got Scott Walker on Twitter today and last night freaking out about the Supreme Court election there. Scott Walker knows that the Republican Party is in trouble before these tariffs. This is a very smart attempt, I believe, on the part of the Chinese to make people squawk in the heartland and force the president to think twice and maybe backtrack on this. I expect to see him backtracking.
All right, so S.E., I'm going to give you a twofer because, first of all, this trade war, is this anything that fiscal conservatives who supported Trump might have imagined? I mean, he campaigned on it, but did they think he'd really follow through?
They should have. And conservatives like me were worried about the rhetoric. The problem is the rhetoric, the trade war rhetoric, the anti-China, getting tough on China rhetoric, his supporters really liked that. Mm-hmm. The question is, will they like it in practice? And when that comes back to some of the areas that voted for Trump, hitting them the hardest, when Chuck Grassley is out talking about how worried he is about his farmers and ranchers in Nebraska, then we'll have to see if the rhetoric is actually met by the policy. And if they support that as much, I imagine that they will not. But look, this is, I think, a negotiation tactic. I think he uses rhetoric. Yeah, I think he uses his rhetoric as a negotiation.
And let's concede that the president has a point about intellectual property theft from China, too.
It is a multi-billion-dollar problem. This isn't just about our trade deficit.
Yeah, but there's a smart way to go about that and a dumb way, and tariffs are the dumb way. The smart way would be through the WTO.
But maybe threatening tariffs isn't as
we
dumb
shall see.
as actual tariffs.
We're going to have to leave it there, but we shall see. We will be back for a bigger conversation. Thank you, panel. First, We have failed. Those harsh words come from one of the president's outgoing advisors. And it's not Donald Trump's only rift with the staff he leads. The panel returns, as I promised, next.
Is a hub for fashion. You can see something very, very interesting is happening. Building amazing creative energy. Fashion Forward is the heart of Dubai's and the Arab world's fashion industry. The selection of designers is fantastic. It's always great to see what's behind the creative process. There are designers that really excited me. One of them is Hussein Bouzaza, and his collection was feminine, but also very unexpected. For instance, the reference to Batman in one of the skirts. It's really interesting to see here in Dubai is the rise of the modest movement and empowering for women to show that they can be truthful to their own beliefs without having to be too revealing or too provocative. Designers want to be part of Dubai. I really could not imagine what it would be to do local fashion without having this amazing platform.
What defines cutting-edge investments in today's global real estate market? Host John Derterios in 1 Square Meter gives you a rare peek behind the trendiest places, the best developments, and unique projects around the world. From San Francisco to Shanghai, 1 Square Meter seeks out the most interesting places and takes an inside look at international properties. 1 Square Meter, Tuesday in Connect the World with Becky Anderson, in association with MR.
Welcome back. Now, whether President Trump is talking about his policy on Russia, his vision for Syria, or a move to protect the border, his plans often seem to take his own government by surprise. Now, sometimes he breaks from the advice of his officials, and sometimes he seems to break from reality. So let's have a reality check. The fact is that his idea of sending troops to the border comes at the same time that illegal crossings drop to the lowest level in 4 decades. And statistics show those who make the crossing are less of a threat than American citizens in terms of violent crime. Those are the facts. Let's conduct a fact-based debate and bring in the panel. Joe, question for you. The president's ratcheting up his rhetoric on immigration. He's directed his Department of Justice to create quotas for judges on deportations. Is this because he's afraid he's losing his base on the issue? Or is this really a response to a real problem? Because those facts would indicate it's more fear than fact.
Well, let's not forget the hyperventilating over this caravan of people who seem to have been coming to the United States.
Hyperventilating being negative or positive?
Negative from the media standpoint, where maybe if the media has over-exaggerated this caravan of people, then that's your own fault. What I'm trying to say is...
So you're blaming the president's favorite station for filling him with...
I think this is clearly the station the president watches the most. But back to the border wall. Obama used this in, I think, 2010 when he decided to put his own National Guard troops on the border wall as a concession to Republicans just to get their support in some of the immigration reforms he was trying to get to. Is this another one of Trump's negotiating points? It might be. Is it a reaction to the fact that he thinks that border crossings are still going up? I mean, is it, even though they're not, I mean...
They're not. And again, yes, politics is perception, but facts matter if you're leader of the free world. It does, objectively. Whether or not we choose to act on them is another conversation that we should be having right now. S.E., here's my question. The president, Democrats made an offer, $25 billion for a border wall. There was the outline of a grand bargain. The prospect of pulling a Nixon in China, almost a cliche, but we're going to hold it out there for a grand bargain. Is this something the president can return to? Is this another negotiating tactic, or is DACA dead, as he said?
I think this is yet another rhetorical negotiating tactic. Look, where you're right is on the border statistics. Those facts are not arguable. But you look at sanctuary cities, and that's a very real issue. It's a very real problem for real people, not just Republicans. And so there is an issue to address. He wants to address it. Is this partly political? 100%. When you lose Ann Coulter, you've lost... You've lost Ann Coulter. Well, she's a proxy for a significant part of his base. And so I think these wild swings at policy, taking troops out of Syria, putting them, those very troops on the border and Mexico. I mean, these are for sure rhetorical offerings to his base, but perhaps also a rhetorical way of starting a conversation on DACA and immigration and foreign policy
Well,
again.
having the conversation. I mean, I don't think he's in any way interested in a serious conversation on DACA. There have been so many chances at a bipartisan deal, Essie, you know that as well as anyone else. And then he goes and takes DACA off the table. Then he goes and lies and says that the possibility of DACA is encouraging illegal migration when DACA only applies to people who've already been here for quite a long time.
Has been great actors on DACA, right? He's not negotiating with himself.
There was a bipartisan clean bill, a clean bill with border funding on the table that he walked away
He also told people, here's what I'm offering, and that included 1.8 million DACA recipients legalized. That was a deal as well.
Let's reality check this through. I want to make sure we got time for another issue too, because this is important, because there are 800,000 American lives at stake, among other things, with regard to the Dreamer population. But we can't ignore outgoing National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who made some pretty remarkable comments about Russia and regret in one of his final speeches. Let's see, we got the clip. We have no clip. Well, what he said was there had been a major mistake, that the problem the government had was not following through on the threat that Russia represented. That seems like a slap at Donald Trump.
It is, but that's why he's the outgoing National Security Advisor, or part of it. You know, I think that he's felt that all along, and it's the kind of independence that the president couldn't tolerate in that position.
Well, this is national security. You know, remember the old line, politics ought to end at the water's edge?
I do remember.
Clearly that's not true anymore. But are we going to miss H.R. McMaster? Are even national security hawks going to miss him in trading him out for John Bolton, another TV star like Kudlow, with real foreign policy credentials, but someone who's hawkish without having the benefit of serving in the military?
What's the difference? You know, a couple months ago at Stanford, Rex Tillerson, then Secretary of State, laid out a very long-term plan for Syria. It involved 5 points. It was not small. President Trump either didn't read that briefing or decided after a few months, without telling his military advisors, I'm going to completely rip that up. So it doesn't really matter who's got his ear, who's brought in. He doesn't seem to listen.
Trump does what he wants to do. He doesn't even inform the people around him.
Right.
I mean, there were reports that when he announced yet again that transgender people weren't going to be allowed to serve, that the Joint Chiefs hadn't been informed. So there are lots of cases in which he is not clearly in dialogue with the people who are supposed to be advising him. It's not even that they're not advising him, or that he's dismissing their advice. He's just not even talking to them, it appears.
With the government he leads, there is a constant pattern of chaos. And I think the question is, Joe, you like that he shoots from the lip, but if there's a total disconnect between the president's statements and his government's policy planning, you got to admit that's a problem.
You know, no, I won't, because that's your job. No. This is who America elected, right? This is someone who the rumors that he doesn't want to have a chief of staff or a communications director might very well be true. I don't know that. This is someone who made some very bold promises and very bold predictions on the campaign trail, and isn't letting some of the people who advise him get in the way of the things he committed to the American public. One of those things with respect to Syria was eradicating ISIS. ISIS is effectually eradicated. That's not completely. The concession that just came out in one of the speeches in the Washington Post, one of the pieces in the Washington Post, was that they don't want to have the threat of an ISIS resurgence. But the point he's trying to make is, if ISIS is defeated, then we should be pulling out of Syria.
I think SE wins the fact point on that.
They're not very irresponsible.
Baghdadi's still out there. SE Cup wins that point on the facts, Joe. I'm sorry to take it away from you, but I thank you. No trophies here, man. But I thank you all for participating nonetheless. Everybody, thank you. But I want to end on a more sober note tonight, because we mark a somber anniversary in the United States, April 4th, 1968, when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, the day before he was shot, Dr. King gave a prophetic speech, which still echoes on today. Take a listen.
And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The next morning, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel. He was 39 years old. Now, at that time, Robert Kennedy was a presidential candidate, senator from New York. He was on his way to a campaign rally in Indianapolis, speaking in a largely African-American community that had not heard the news yet of Dr. King's assassination. He went and he spoke without notes and gave what many consider one of the finest extemporaneous speeches in American political history.
My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote,